In this lesson, we'll see how we can utilize the Mental Ray Fast Subsurface Skin Shader. So this node can be found together with the rest of the actual subsurface shaders. So we can go down and drop in the Fast Subsurface Skin Shader. There we go. Now if you're using anything newer than Maya 2008, you will notice that things like the light map and the actual texture that are able to read this light map back in are automatically connected for you. So if you are using an older version, though, you will have to go through the process of connecting these manually. If you do want to learn about that process, you can refer to our lesson on dealing with the Fast Light Map node, where we'll show you how to manually connect these. So for now, let's take this Fast Skin Shader, let's just middle click, and drop it onto our object. And now let's just take a quick render at what we have. And once the render is complete, you'll see that we do have now a little bit of a subsurface scattering effect that's beginning to happen here. You can see that we actually do have two lights set up in our scene, one for a little bit of front illumination, which is right up here, and then the other one which is providing some illumination coming from the back, so we can start to get a little bit of light that penetrates through things like the ears. So let's start to actually sort of tune this shader and start to get it looking the way we want. So a lot of the actual attributes that we find on this Fast Skin Shader are really identical to a lot of the other attributes that are found on all the other variants of the subsurface shading nodes. We have things like the scattering weight, scatter radius. Really everything is pretty much the same as far as diffuse color, diffuse weighting. So if you do want to learn more about these particular attributes and what things like the weight and the radius all mean, you can refer to our lesson on dealing with the Fast Simple Shader. So for now, you will notice that one of the major differences with this Fast Skin Shader, though, is the fact that we do have an extra attribute for the actual scattering. With most of these other shaders, we only have two attributes, one for front scattering and one for back scattering. But with this one, we actually do have a third one, so we kind of get a middle layer of skin. So let's talk a little bit about just how we can tune this and start to get this looking a little bit more like a flesh-colored. So first we have the diffuse color, which again is really just the surface illumination, just the same as all the other subsurface shading nodes. So with this one, typically I like to start with something that is a little bit on the red side, just a very, very subtle red color. There we go, something very, very light. There we go. And typically I like to keep this at a very low value, so that way overall we get very, very little contribution from the diffuse color. But most of our color from the skin we actually want to come from the epidermal layer, which is really the outermost layer of your skin. So in this case, we can try to find something that's a little bit darker, a little bit more of a flesh tone. There we go, so we can maybe start to get this a little bit lighter. There we go, and start to find something kind of like that. There we go, and once we have this pretty much set up, we can begin testing this against some of our other attributes. So again, just like we talked about in our lesson on dealing with the Fast Skin Shader, the Fast Subsurface Shader, a lot of times I find it to be useful to come in and just start by tweaking these attributes one at a time. So we'll start with the epidermis. Alright, so we can start to see our result here. Now overall this does start to seem a little bit too bright. We are getting quite a bit of light contribution that happens in some of these areas. So let's start to kind of choke this back a little bit. Just make this a little bit easier to see. We can increase the epidermal scatter weight. But let's start to take this radius, which is really controlling how far into the surface this light is able to penetrate. So let's take that and start to really drop this down to something like 0.5. So that way we're only allowing light to only penetrate about 1/2 unit into the skin. Remember, this is going to be the outermost layer of skin, so not a lot of translucency will happen at this point. There we go. So that now gives us a little bit more control and gives us a little less of a kind of fleshy or really kind of a plasticky appearance. So that, again, just kind of keeps the light from penetrating quite so far in. So if we need to, we can always come back and adjust this, but for now, I'm going to set the weight on this back to 0. And now I'll move on to the next one, set the weight up to 1, so we get full value. Now this subdermal scatter is representing your second layer of skin, the one that's just underneath your epidermis. So this one, we'll typically want this to be a little bit more of a kind of a pinkish color to start to simulate sort of the look of kind of tissue that would be underneath there. So again, just try to find something that kind of has a little bit of a fleshy appearance. Okay, something like this. Alright, so the subdermal scatter radius right now is set to a very, very high value, and you can see right now our scene right now is not very big at all. So let's start to take this scatter radius and really start to drop this down, because we know for sure that we won't need light to penetrate 25 units, with this being as small of a character as it is. So let's see what we get with this. There we go. So again, now we start to get a little bit more of this fleshy appearance, or some of this sort of blood colored tissue that would be underneath here. So right now it looks like the scatter radius is probably still a little bit too high. So let's start to bump this down. There we go. So in our case, a value of 2 looks like this will do a pretty good job to begin with. So that way we really don't get a whole lot of this extra light spill that happens back in this area. Really, anything that would come through, we would want to come from the backscattering. So again, once we have this set, we can take this weight, start to drop that down, and now bump up the weight for our backscatter, and we can test that. So again, just like before, we know that the backscatter radius and depth are way too high for our particular scene, so let's start by dropping this down. And again, just start with a quick render. There we go, and now we can actually see some light coming from the backlight that's actually now starting to provide a little bit of this backscattering. So really, isolating each one of these components and being able to work on them one at a time makes it much, much easier to see the effect of that one particular component. So once we have these all set up, then we can start to mix and match the values as we see fit. So let's maybe start to even drop this down a little bit lower as far as the radius goes. Right now we are getting a little bit too much spill that happens in this shoulder area. So let's see if we can narrow that down and try to keep this more in the ear. Alright, so that now again kind of chokes this back and really just kind of limits this to sort of the thinnest parts of the ear, or the thinnest parts of the mesh here. So now let's begin to sort of add some of these values back in. So let's drop down this backscattering just a little bit more. And now we can start to add in something like the subdermal scatter. So we'll start with something like 0.5. And again, as I mentioned, a lot of the weight or a lot of the coloration of my characters, I like to come from this epidermal scatter. So I'm going to make sure this is set to 1. So let's take a look at what we have. Alright, so at the moment we probably have a little bit too much of this scattering effect that's happening from this subdermal scatter. You can see that we do have something that looks very, very fake at the moment, and that we could probably stand to increase some of the intensity of this backscattering color that's happening back here. So let's start by dropping down this subdermal scatter a little bit more. And then for this backscattering color, right now we do have sort of an issue as far as being able to control the color of this, because you will start to see once we begin to increase and bring a lot of this red color in, that we also start to introduce a lot of that red color back here in the shoulders as well, and for the rest of the head. So one of the things we can do with any of these different color attributes is actually add in some kind of a texture. So in this case, I've already created a ramp that you can see is very bright red on top and very dark red down below. Now this is built to correspond with this head's UV layout. So if I take a look inside the texture editor for this, you can see that the ears for this character are all the way up at the top. So what we can do is actually align this to where the red parts correspond to where the ears are, and then we can actually start to take this and bring the rest of it down. So in our case, since we have all of this actually just laid out up here, this should work just fine for us. So let's come up here, and we'll take our fast subsurface shader. We'll take our ramp that we've already created and drop this in. Alright, so let's see what this does for us. If we save this for comparison, we'll re-render. Alright, and there we go. So you can see what we had before and what we have now. It is a very subtle difference as far as the overall shading, but you can see what we had before. We had a little bit brighter backscattering effect that was happening back in here. And now, with this ramp, you can see that we're able to now darken this up in everywhere except the ear area, where it actually now becomes a little bit easier to see. Alright, so really, again, we could do this with all the other attributes as far as adding in controls and textures to control things like the epidermal, the subdermal, and the backscatter colors. Now, as far as the other attributes that are found in this skin shader, we do have controls for specularity, and there are actually pretty significant controls for that. This actual specular model that we have here is actually the exact same attributes that are found in this MISSS skin specular. Alright, so we actually won't dedicate any time in this particular lesson to talk about these attributes, since they are the exact same things found in this particular node. So if you do want to learn more about these specular attributes, you can refer to our lesson on the fast skin specular node. But as far as the other attributes that are found in here, again, we do have control over things like the algorithm for scale conversion, fall off. Again, exactly the same as what we can find in the fast shader. So really, the only difference between this fast skin and some of these other shaders is really just the fact that we do have a little bit more control over the actual scattering effect, and that we do have a few extra scattering properties to give us a little bit more control over that. So that's a look at how we can utilize this fast skin shader.